Right, hello everybody, and welcome to Geopolitics in Conflict show. Very excited to be with you today, as always. But there is a special day today because of my guest. He's a good friend of mine, and usually you guys know me by now. I don't use that term very loosely. So, without further ado, I'm going to bring in my guest, but I'm going to, of course, give you an introduction of who my guest is. Then we'll get into the topic because we have a lot to learn. So, and I'm excited about it. So, my guest today is Dr. Warwick Powell. He is an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology. He's also the chairman of Smart Trade Network Groups of companies. He's also the president of Data Integrity in Supply Chain Association Incorporation. And he is also a senior fellow at the Tahi Institute. And if anytime you think about Tahi Institute, Aina Tangen comes to mind. So, and by the way, guys, I am going to bring both of them to the channel for a very enriched conversation. And by the way, I'm going to put the full bio for Dr. Powell in the description, along with other links for his Substacks and other social media. So, all right, let's get into this. Welcome, Dr. Powell.
It's great to be with you. It's good to see both of you.
Very excited.
All right, David, do you have the first question or do I have the first question?
I have the first question here.
Okay,
because
all right,
I prepared it. So, all right, Warwick. When we think about how the new multipolar order is moving, shifting the geopolitical landscape, one aspect I'd like to have your insights for our viewers to have a better understanding, given your background in the economics and business, is what impacts this new multipolar order is going to have or is having on the global economic order.
Yeah, great question, David. Look, I think it's important to put the current experiences that we're having today and observing the changes we're observing take place into a little bit of a historical context, because obviously where we are at today is a result of the passage of events and time over the past few decades or even longer. What's been happening over the last few decades is a very significant, though evolutionary, transformation of the structure of the global economy. So for a big period after the Second World War, the global economy was largely divided into two main parts. One was the economy that revolved around the Soviet Union and through the Comintern. And the second one was a global economy in which the United States economy played the pivot role. So, and we'll mainly focus on the shape of that economy, because the Soviet economy and the Comintern-based global economic network has fallen aside 30-odd years ago. So in that post-war period, we had a global economic system in which the United States economy played the central role. It was a system that was largely a hubs and spokes model. The United States represented over 50% of global GDP after the Second World War. It made most of the things that the vast majority of the world wanted, and therefore the United States was able to leverage that core position as the global manufacturing powerhouse to drive out a program of both economic power and authority, and off the back of that also to underpin a political authority. These two things work together, economic transitions and changes in political institutions. Where we're at today, well, we're at a point where the global economic structure and the contours of global commerce have changed so much that the United States economy is no longer in the center, and we are starting to see the consolidation of a more decentralized global economic system where there are multiple networks of connectivity. And the most obvious part of that is China, of course, but there are other important economic poles. And those economic poles are the emergence of Russia, not only as a significant energy player, but also in other natural resources and foods. We're also, of course, seeing the transformation of the West Asian economies in Saudi Arabia and those oil and energy-rich regions. Southeast Asia as a whole is also rising through the ranks. So we've got many economic poles now, if you will, or many economic centers. That makes it almost impossible for the political hegemony to be sustained. And that's where we're at. So from an economic point of view, the opportunities, if you will, are to continue pursuing the economic development and growth opportunities in the high growth regions of the world, the developing world, the global majority. And the risks, I guess, is how do you manage the transition from a highly centralized global economic system to this very decentralized or distributed global economic system. They're the challenges we face now. Politically, those who benefited from that centralized economic system are doing everything they can to cling on to all the hegemonic benefits, I guess, that system gave to them. But that's ultimately a futile effort.
Well, so it's interesting that you bring that up because, you know, I do see that there are absolutely, you know, the US hegemony is trying to claw and hold on to what it's got, while at the same time making some very short-sighted financial decisions. We talk all the time about how sanctioning Russia to the extent that the United States has actually backfired substantially in ways that I don't think the powers that be thought would happen. So I have a couple of questions for you about the US-China, more or less, potential for sort of economic warfare. So I heard this the other day, and I thought it was a very interesting take. It was the former CIA guy, I forgot his name.
Rosamante.
Something like that.
Okay.
Anyway, he suggested that World War III is actually already underway and that World War III doesn't look the way that people thought it would. It looks like economic warfare instead of sort of a nuclear, you know, a large-scale nuclear attack. What do you think about that, especially in terms of the global South versus the West? Do you think a sort of World War III type economic war, more or less, is already happening?
Look, there is something of a sense of warfare going on now. And you mentioned the economic war, and I'll touch on that in a moment, but I'll put a bit of sort of non-economic context on this as well. In the 1990s, there was a significant debate in the United States at the time as to how the United States should relate to China. And there were two, broadly speaking, competing schools of thought. One was an engagement school of thought. The other one was to continue to keep China isolated from the American-dominated global economy. At the end of the day, the former forces, those arguing for engagement and to bring China into the tent, prevailed, and that manifested itself as China's ascension to the World Trade Organization. The concerns that were articulated at the time was that this would not be in the United States' economic or political interests, but the advocates of engagement, such as then President Bill Clinton, had a view that China could be transformed in America's interests and in America's shadow, if you will, by virtue of imposing an economic liberal regime through the conditions that would be imposed as part of participating in the World Trade Organization. So the ambition at the time was to transform China. We know that that was the ambition, not only because there was talk of it at the time, but more recently, Jake Sullivan has confirmed in a speech that he gave in February this year that the United States has, for the past few decades, sought to change and mold or shape China, and it has failed. China did not become like the United States, and in fact, if you go back only a few years, there was an article in Foreign Affairs magazine that actually reflected upon this 15, 16 years of engagement through the WTO, and which concluded that that China had defied Washington. China did not become what Washington thought it should become as part of this modernization, liberalization process. So that's the sort of context. Now, what that has manifested into now is the re-emergence of a spiritual war as much as it is an economic war. So the idea of the spiritual war is to continue pursuing this notion that if you can't save the souls of the Chinese and transform the Chinese in our own image, then clearly they are the enemy. And there are significant biblical references in some parts of the American political discourse around all of this, that China represents the enemy, the devil at work, and that we are approaching an end of days experience. So that's that part. The economic dimensions has been in play now for the best part of 6-7 years. And as you touched on, many of the actions taken as part of this economic war, which seeks to contain, limit, restrict, slow down China, has actually, and also Russia for that matter, has actually backfired. I've described this process as something like an autoimmune response, where the system, in the name of protecting itself, ends up attacking itself. So systems and the weaponization of key institutions of the post Cold War economic order are progressively being undermined by those who built the system. You know, whether it's the weaponization of the US dollar system as a means of payment and a store of value, whether it's sanctioning the processes of trade flows, none of that contributes to confidence and stability in that old centralized system. But that old centralized system was already starting to fray. So if you realize that the visual that you can sort of and your community can have in their mind is it's like a neural network, where what we have today is a whole lot of centers of energy that are continually connecting with each other, sparking energy flows. And that contrasts with a system where there was one center and everything else revolved around it. Now, once you start having this decentralized or distributed multipolar nodal network, there's no putting it away. And every time the response of the dominant system to try to stop this from happening or to punish people from doing this, it actually adds fuel to these nodes.
Yep.
So I think, you know, to bring a bit of a circuitous discussion back to your question, there has been, in some respects, an economic war. It's an unnecessary economic war, and a futile economic war. It's an economic war that does more harm to those prosecuting it than to those who are being targeted by it. And it does not ultimately stop the economic forces at work that are transforming the contours of the global economic order.
Interesting. Since you mentioned the economic war, this brings me to consider, for example, and of course, for our audience, I would love to have your insights into the trade war that's existing right now between Europe, US, and China.
Yeah.
We're all aware of the tariffs, the 100%, the tariffs that the United States put on electric vehicles for Chinese. We are aware also of the European 40% tariffs on the Chinese EVs. And of course, the Turks. Turkey also added another 38%. What is the significance? We all know the significance of it, but what is the message of all this? Is this a hint that the Europeans or the collective West, including Turkey for that matter, are unable to slow down the progress of China, economically speaking?
Look, let's deal with the US first. The US embarked on a process of relocating a whole lot of its productive activities to places like China during the course of the 1990s and into the 2000s. And that accompanied significant displacement of employment and industries in the United States. Having said that, quite a number of studies, and this is a controversial area, but quite a number of studies nonetheless conclude that the problem in terms of changes to the labour market in the United States were driven a lot more by technology changes than it was by trade. And even if trade did play a role, so let's say trade did play a role, which was the relocation of labour-intensive activities to other parts of the world, the public policy challenge wasn't so much about stopping that from happening. The public policy challenge was to take the aggregate gains from open trade and ensure that those gains were distributed fairly. And that meant providing the right kinds of transitional support and assistance to displaced communities, displaced industries, and displaced workers to be ready for the next wave of employment opportunities. What happened instead in the United States is that the adversely impacted communities were largely left by the wayside, and the upsides from opening up trade, the upsides of the distribution of the aggregate benefits, was largely captured by Wall Street. So the financialization of the US political economy meant that the benefits of trade were disproportionately distributed. So that was the first problem. Now, in response to that, we've had tariffs introduced in 2018. Again, recent studies would suggest that the introduction of those tariffs have not brought the jobs back. They did deliver a political dividend, however, to Trump in terms of being able to flip votes from the Democrats to his candidacy. So there was certainly a political dividend, even if there hasn't been an economic dividend. The other point about tariffs and the trade deficit in manufacturers of the US is that, in part, the deficit that the United States has is a necessary feature. It's not a bug. It's actually a necessary feature of a financialized hegemony. And that's because, to maintain its network of alliances around the world, the United States' strongest offer to its alliance partners, other than providing them, quote, security, unquote, via the presence of military bases and assorted defense infrastructure in these countries, is to enable these countries to develop industries and export their products to the United States. So the trade deficit has actually been a necessary condition of the United States global hegemony. So trying to unwind that actually also unwinds the conditions that make possible hegemony. Denying partners access to the US market does not help partner economies. It weakens them, which further weakens the hegemony. Now we get to Europe, right? So Europe has been going through its own deindustrialization problems. And that's happened in large part for two reasons. Three. One has been a slightly longer term reason, which is a slowdown in economic innovation. The second reason is the energy cost shock that took place 24 months ago or so. And the energy cost shock was very much a self-inflicted wound. So again, this is a case of causing yourself damage in the name of defending yourself. Now, the third reason is that as the US has tried to promote industrial development, it's initiated a whole range of policies favourable to attracting capital that ultimately leads to further hollowing out of European industry as those companies, uneconomic as they are in Europe, relocate their operations to North America. So Europe's got a triple whammy going on here, which is very difficult to resolve unless it's willing to find a space for more autonomous decision-making in terms of its economic policies and its energy policies. Now, one of the interesting features of what's going on with China is that Chinese industrial capital has developed an incredible amount of contemporary high-tech competency. So Chinese high-tech manufacturing has benefited from a series of things that have come together. And a lot of this revolves around the know-how that has developed over 20 years of learning by doing. So we have in China now a significant energy transition, which is providing access to energy at lower marginal cost than was ever previously imagined possible. We have a process of automation that's taking place, made possible in part, of course, by reduced energy costs. And thirdly, we have an economic and supply chain setup driven by the learnings over the last 20 years that is driving incredible process efficiencies. Now, one approach when you have that kind of comparative advantage is to become a dominant exporter. China, however, seems to be doing a couple of things at the same time. One, of course, is that it does export, though the extent to which it exports its manufactured outputs is usually overstated. It exports about 13, 14% of its manufactured outputs. Nothing
really?
particularly
That's
great.
it?
Wow. I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either. That's much smaller than...
Yeah. So we look at history. In the 1990s, Chinese manufactured outputs exported about 18%. About 15%. It then rose to 2004 to about 18, 19%.
Yeah.
And that was actually when it peaked. That was actually peak export orientation. And ever since then, as Chinese manufacturing has developed and grown, much of that growth has actually been absorbed by the domestic economy. So much so that come 2020, 2021, the data shows that it's about 13% now that's exported. The other thing that's happening is that Chinese capital is actually exporting capital itself. So we're seeing a lot of stories, no doubt you will have seen them as well, that Chinese battery factories and Chinese EV companies are actually establishing manufacturing and assembly facilities in other parts of the world. So they're taking fixed capital and know-how into other countries and developing factories and value adding. Now that goes from Brazil, Mexico, Malaysia, Thailand, Hungary, Spain, Fork of Italy coming on board, and of course Turkey now, all being destinations for the export of Chinese capital and manufacturing capability. The tariffs that have been talked about in the EU are unlikely to be particularly meaningful economically. They're in some ways too low to be meaningful. And the hope, of course, is to perhaps slow down some of the exports to give some breathing room to European manufacturers to catch up. But it's interesting that Europe's main manufacturing centre, main manufacturing economy, Germany, has actually been quite resistant and concerned about the risks of a trade war around manufacturers. So the Europeans are, I think, to some extent at 6 or 7 at the moment, not quite sure what their macroeconomic policy posture should be. What it probably should be is focused around resolving its energy problem. That's actually its first order. It needs to resolve high-cost energy challenges. Secondly, it needs to think seriously about how it brings in new technology and industrial competency. And resolving both of those problems means it actually needs to work closely with China, not the other way around. So the autoimmune reactions at the moment around that immediate sense of anxiety that seems to be prevalent across the transatlantic bodies politic, unfortunately is leading to quite aggressive defensive actions that are not necessarily in the medium or long-term interests of these communities and economies.
I have sort of a little bit of a follow-up to something that you just talked about in terms of manufacturing, because one of the big things that Joe Biden touts is how many billions of dollars he has put towards manufacturing infrastructure here in the United States and bringing manufacturing back here to the United States. And he has done that. I mean, their administration, I'm not going to credit much to him outside of, eating ice cream, but his administration has put money into this infrastructure. However, it does seem to me, at least, that it's a little bit of a too late kind of situation, because we don't have a lot of the really key things that would make manufacturing really work here. One of which being the trained students coming up to be able to really do high-tech manufacturing. So what do you think of that? Do you think it really is a reality that the US will bring some level of real manufacturing back on mainland US? Or do you think that's in its own right kind of a pipe dream?
Look, I think you sort of hinted at the complexities of modern manufacturing, and successful modern manufacturing is an ecosystem problem. It's not a single factor problem. And we're seeing that manifest in the problems that have been experienced by TSMC in trying to get its fabs up and running in Arizona, for example. Now, that's an ecosystem problem. It's not that they can't get the machines. Yes, you can get machines, but actually making the whole jigsaw puzzle work is something that requires an ecosystem. So that's your supply chains, that's your workforce, and that's your downstream distribution networks as well. And clearly trying to pull that off, thinking that you can just do it with a large amount of federal government subsidy, underestimates how complex the problems are. The issues around skilled labour is particularly interesting because this goes to that issue of how do you manage transitions as economic structures change. So when labour-intensive industries begin to transform, and many of them went offshore, as we discussed earlier, the public policy challenge, the challenge for a community is, well, what are we going to empower these people in these communities to be able to do in the future? And the skills gap that is quite clearly evident now in the United States speaks to a failure to recognize the need to support skills development and empowerment when the transitions happen. So this is really the issue of how do you deal with change? You can either try and hold it back, which is pretty hard to do, and it's very expensive to hold back change, or you manage change by grasping change and being part of the transformation processes yourself. Unfortunately, making manufacturing work requires more than just some subsidies. It requires addressing the broader structural imbalances that are evident now in the composition of American capital. So a lot of American capital now spends its life sloshing around the money markets and the market of fictitious capital. Right? So if I just use some sort of, let's call them some technical concepts, there's a difference between things that have exchange value and things that have use value. And use value are things that enterprises and people will use to do things that are meaningful to them, you know, to consume, to use, to make other things that are useful, to enjoy, you know, an experience, whatever it happens to be. They're things that have a use value. And they are the things that make up the real economy in the end. The things, however, that the United States political economy has become very good at has been to create things that have exchange value. And so when you start having an economic system which is dominated by not just exchange value per se, but the ability to exchange value for, or to trade exchange value almost in a never-ending process without it ever connecting up to things that are of use value, at some point, a very small proportion of people within that community become financially very, very wealthy. And they do that because the monetary value of this exchange value rises. But the real economy, the capacity to deliver use value to society, diminishes relatively. So if you want to rebuild manufacturing, which is in effect to rebuild an economy that can do things that have use value, you've actually got to reduce the proportionate role that exchange value plays. Now, that's the theory piece. So what does that mean in practical terms? In practical terms, it means tackling the bloated nature of Wall Street. It means
yeah, no joke.
it means you know, revisiting the legislative framework that fast track financialization. So I'm talking Glass-Steagall. You know, when Glass-Steagall was abandoned, you saw a rush of money capital out of activities that were focused on creating use value into activities that created exchange value. Now, unless you tackle that, it's going to be very, very hard to ultimately create the ecosystem across the United States as a complex economic system to meet the aspirations that the policy has you know, announced. Now, these are big political problems, right? Because tackling financial elites and diminishing their claim on the total financial resources of a society so that those financial resources can be deployed in other areas is a big political call. And so far, it would seem that there's very few politicians in the Congress at the moment that are either aware that this is what needs to be done, let alone willing to do something about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's literally asking the people at the top with all the money to give a bunch of their money back and give a bunch of their power back. But that seems like a hope that we would all wish for, but that seems extremely unlikely. Those people didn't get to that position by being very kind and generous and looking at the good of the world around them, right? So in a real sense, you know, is there anything that we sort of as a people, we as a global people, and then individually can do to sort of help flip that? Because it is true. I mean, if you look at the United States, really our biggest industries are medical, pharmaceutical, right? Wall Street is huge and out of control. We mostly, you know, I think medical spending is, I think it's the biggest industry here in the United States. And so, you know, is there anything that you see that can actually be done to sort of change it? Because I think if we're going to wait for the people at the top to make those changes out of the goodness of their hearts, I think we're going to be waiting for the rest of eternity.
Look, I think it's important to get some perspective on the extent of the challenges too, right? So you touched on medical. The expenses on health services contributes about makes up about 18% of the United States GDP. Now that's almost double the global average for expenditure on health services.
Yep.
At the same
wow.
At the same time, key measures of health sector success would suggest that money is achieving very, very poor productivity outcomes. So life expectancy has been falling now for the first time in decades, and infant mortality rates are rising for the first time in decades. So on key performance indicators for a health system, you would probably say it's not doing particularly well. The second feature of the health system is, of course, the profit taking that health insurance garners from the system, and the third. And so that's the exchange value piece. That's the monetization of something that separates use value from exchange value. And the third thing that's actually important to remark upon is that the American pharmaceuticals industry, which benefits, of course, considerably from regulatory arrangements that confers upon it a whole range of rent-seeking benefits, pays very little tax in America itself because almost all of its corporate structuring provides for it globally tax-effective arrangements. So that's your health situation. The stock market, or Wall Street generally, is also a very interesting thing, and it's because it's interesting in two respects. One is that something like 90% of the capital value of the market today is actually in the hands of about 10% of stockholders.
Mm-hmm.
Over 50% of Americans actually own shares, but clearly the vast majority of those shareholders own a very, very small proportion of the total value of the stock exchange. So again, that speaks to a level of concentration of capital in the American political economy. Something that I saw the other day, and that was the Buffett index, which looks at the market cap value of the stock exchange to GDP, and I think it's getting close to about 180%. Now, there's arguments about what a suitable level is, and Buffett I think talks about 80% is probably where it represents fair value. But the key point that I want to make here, when you've got these two very distinct measures in front of you, is again, this shows how exchange value and the exchange of exchange value is actually a far important part of the American political economy.
Mm-hmm.
So there's also been a report recently, and I'll share it with you, and you might want to then drop it into the description later as well, is a report on the concentration of corporate ownership of productive resources in the United States, which shows again that I can't remember the numbers offhand, but it's the vast majority of productive capacity, fixed capital, is actually owned by a small proportion of companies. So once again, we've got a political economy that's incredibly concentrated. So these are some of the sort of dimensions of the challenges. Now, what does a community do about it? Well, far be it for me to give advice to American citizens about what they should or shouldn't do, but it is clear that there is a growing level of resentment, disappointment, anger, frustration, that the system, as it's evolved, is no longer working, that the American dream is now a nightmare for many, and that we have a system where Wall Street now dominates Main Street. And because of that, a growing proportion of Americans, unfortunately, are forced to eke out a living on Struggle Street. Mm-hmm. And at some point in time, looking at this from the outside, you can see an incredible amount of pressure build. Now, what are those safety valves? Right? And how does this system respond to that? I don't know. I have seen many discussions, serious discussions, of people concerned about the risks of political violence. People talk about civil war. And of course, there are advocates for non-violent legislative change as well. How this plays out, I think, is going to be one of the most important factors that will affect not only the quality of life and the nature of the United States for the next 20 years, but actually how it spills over into the international arena. And in part, it's because an America that's not at peace with itself really struggles to be at peace with the rest of the world. So we all hope that, these issues in the United States do find resolutions, because it affects all of us.
Well, let's hope. Let's hope.
Yeah.
I like to shift the conversation to the financial aspects, especially with this, Warwick. I would like to talk about the BRICS. And why am I mentioning BRICS here? Especially from the financial aspect. And this is in relation to what just happened with Enbridge and the Saudis' decision, but also where BRICS is moving forward in trying, and of course with the Russians taking the lead on this, as far as ensuring the creation of an alternative to the SWIFT system. Because we have, and it's no secret, we have abused the use of the dollar, weaponized it beyond belief, and especially with the move by the Saudis when they made the decision not to renew their agreements. That was, even though it was not in paper, it was verbal. I was aware of it because I spent time in Saudi Arabia at that time, and I asked about the usage of the dollar when it comes down to the oil transactions. To me, with that decision they made, trying to get on the train with other countries. Where are they headed? Where do you see this trend moving forward, and will it have an impact in changing the world order as far as the financial system?
Absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, the dominant role of the US dollar has been part and parcel of its political economy of global hegemony. So the idea of the United States economy being the central pivot around which all other economies revolved actually gave strength to the US dollar. Now, as the global economic system, the foundations of real value creation and real value. So this is the use value question again, right? Useful things. So as other economies and other locations were able to create more useful things and then begin the process of exchanging those useful things with others, the need for the US dollar in that process objectively diminished. Now, the US dollar was continued to be used, of course, because it was available, it was convenient, and for a long time it was predictable and relatively safe. Not that long ago, I remember seeing a senior Chinese banker from the PBOC asked, well, what's your preferred currency? The response was, well, a currency that's safe and predictable. Right? Because when you're using something as a means of exchange, you need to know that in 6 months' time, in 12 months' time, in 2 years' time, that you're still able to use that means of exchange and swap it for a relatively predictable amount of something that's use value. Right? Relatively, it's obviously not locked in place, but you need to have some confidence that that potential exchange value can convert into a given amount of use value. Now, the weaponization of the US dollar system has, of course, sped up the processes of countries exploring more direct interactions with each other without the need for a US dollar intermediary. But it was already happening beforehand for lots of other reasons. Sometimes there were reasons of convenience, sometimes there were reasons of cost effectiveness, but they weren't particularly reasons that were focused around geopolitics per se. But of course, that is one of the big overriding drivers now. So over the course of the last 10 years or so, maybe a little bit more than that now, we've seen the development of key institutions that are necessary for the development of a decentered global financial architecture that supports national currency-based trade transactions. So those features include swap arrangements entered into by the central banks of different countries. There are many swap arrangements in place now between the People's Bank of China and 40-odd other institutions around the world. The Central Bank of India has done the same. The Russian Central Bank's done the same. So they're providing swap arrangements. The second thing that they've all done is that they've created independent messaging systems. So when cross-border transactions take place, what's actually happening is that the central banks of the two countries involved are making adjustments on their ledgers. So for that to happen, the people managing the ledgers need to receive instructions from the other side. So that's your messaging system. They're telling one party's telling the other party to make an adjustment to a ledger. Now, if you're in a position to block those messages from being sent, you obviously stop the processes by which those ledger adjustments can be made, and therefore you stop payments from happening. So that's the second thing. Now, that's connected to a technology issue as well. So it's not just an institutional question, but it's a technology question, because the ability of the United States in particular to weaponize SWIFT comes from the fact that the one of the main SWIFT digital data centers is actually in Virginia. So the vast majority up to now of world data flows ends up going through Virginia. And because it goes through Virginia, the United States has been able to exercise territorial jurisdiction over that facilities and, of course, in effect, take a copy of everything. What it does with that, well, some of it you know, we know, some of it we speculate, and some of it we just don't know. But it has historically been able to intercede data flows, messages, including financial messaging, and the technical architecture, which is things like mBridge, is now being developed so that the world is not exposed to a technical environment where the United States is in a position to either intercede or to censor digital transactions. Now, BRICS, so these key pieces are coming into place, right? Then you've got digital currencies. And in many ways, digital currencies is the second last piece of the jigsaw puzzle. Digital currencies makes the transaction costs a lot lower. So one of the historic reasons why the US dollar was used was because it was easy to manage the relative values between different currencies if you had a single value against which they all related to. Digitalization actually makes this process of harmonizing value across a network of different national currencies something quite quick and easy to do. And the last piece of the jigsaw puzzle, and one which will take a lot longer to roll out, is the digitalization of supply chains themselves. Because when we're exchanging things, when trade takes place, what's actually happening is three things have to come together to make it all work. One is the real things themselves. Containers of stuff, for example, have to physically move from one place to another. The second thing that has to happen is that the information about that whole process needs to be satisfactory to everyone concerned. The insurance companies, the shippers, the bankers, the freight forwarders, the warehouses, they all receive information about these shipments. Because without all that information, the payment doesn't get made. So what connects up the movement of payments and the movement of physical goods is actually the movement of information. And the more you can streamline costs of collecting information about the economic system, the production system, and the logistics system, the better you are able to provide the right information to those managing the financial ledgers. So they're the pieces of this process that are taking place now. What we see on the surface is BRICS, the SCO talking about national currency settlements, the New Development Bank, which is the BRICS Bank, raising capital in national currencies to be able to provide development finance in national currencies. That's the experience, but the underlying infrastructure that I've described is actually what's making it all possible.
Very interesting.
You know, it's interesting. So it's interesting that you talk about the basically server farm or data center in Virginia, because I've watched over the years, I've watched the progress of the internet cables, right? Because the internet cables, for the most part, all went through the United States. For a long, long time, no matter where you were in the world, the internet cables were all coming through the United States. And I don't think anybody for 1 second believes that the NSA wasn't paying attention to what was coming through the internet in the United States. And so now if you look, you know, China's putting its own cables in the ocean, under the sea, and they're really building up a lot of infrastructure in that way to make sure that not every piece of communication actually has to go through the United States. So it's interesting that you're talking about that, because fundamentally it looks like other countries are building up the infrastructure to bypass the US in pretty much every way that matters. And in some ways that also seems like what the BRI is, the Belt and Road Initiative, is China's way to ensure that they have access to the resources that they need outside of the control of the United States.
Yeah, but when you control the pipes and the intersections, if you will, then you're in a position to control most things. And I think what's happened over the last, particularly the last 10 years, is that we've seen the development of a whole new set of networks that enable the flow of things. So, you know, global economic interactions really is about the flow of goods, the flow of people, the flow of funds, the flow of data. And when you look at these systems of flow, they do rely upon infrastructure, whether it's fiber optic cables, whether it's satellites, whether it's server farms, real ports, roads, railroads, ships, etc., etc. And being able to protect yourself, if you will, from a third party being able to, in effect, control the flows of these value that you're involved in is actually a really important part of ensuring national sovereignty.
Yep.
And in the last 10 years, we've seen, I guess, a rediscovery to some extent of why national sovereignty in an age of global interconnectedness is actually really important.
Yeah.
So we've had a process of globalization where its strongest advocates, particularly from the early 1990s onward, in large part saw the development of a global system where multinational companies would rise above nation states and subordinate nation states in the overall governance of the global economic flows. Now, that, of course, hasn't been unnoticed, and it hasn't taken place smoothly. And in many regards, it's never really become a reality because nation states aren't things you can just get rid of, you know, with a stroke.
Right.
And so nation states have become far more attuned to what's at stake now. Now, so if we look at just the flow of data, we've got this network of pipes of fiber optic cables, satellites, data centers. But on top of that, we've also got a layer of applications that enable people and enterprises to interact with this infrastructure. Let's call that software and operating systems. Right? So for the last 20 years, most of the world has not only engaged in a process of information flows made possible by physical infrastructure that runs through Virginia, but it's done so using operating systems and software that largely confers rent opportunities and other forms of controls to a very small number of international, but basically American big tech firms. In parallel to that, there's been a very different movement around information technology. So when the internet first came on the scene, there was a lot of hope invested in the internet as a leveling infrastructure. Of course, that's not what happened. And with the emergence of big tech dominating the infrastructure, we had a parallel reaction to that, in large part in the US. And that came out of the techno-libertarian movement that was very concerned that the internet was being abused by the security apparatuses of the state. And so we started to see a real bubbling of an open source software community, developing tools and applications and operating systems that were not subject to the control of central authorities.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of those tools have widespread use, but nonetheless was very spread out and never had that sense of critical mass, other than Linux. Right? But a lot of the other things were always subject to the whims of, the extent to which people in communities were able to add and improve these tools. What's happened in the last 5 years, though, is that software developers and large companies in the technology space, particularly from China and Russia and other parts of the world, have embraced open source technology platforms as a way of developing the next generation of operating systems and digital applications that also protects users from the previous hegemonic system. And we're starting to see not only an environment where national currencies are starting to play a bigger role in interactions between countries, but technology ecosystems that enable what I've called a digital Westphalia to emerge, where nation states will be able to develop their own operating systems, put in place their own security infrastructure to protect the data. And at the same time, because they've been built on common architectures, to have the interoperability that you need to maintain the flow of information between companies and people in different countries, but with a national sovereignty layer added to it. So these are the big transformations that are taking place, and they're all integrated with each other.
That's very, very interesting.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, it's the only thing that makes any kind of sense, right? I don't, here in the United States, we don't even trust that we're not being spied on regularly. So other countries know that they are. Okay, I have two more questions that are
Yeah,
burning.
go ahead, because I have the last segment of the
Okay.
conversation. I'm keeping something after you're done
Okay.
with your questions.
Okay, so I have two burning questions because this is something that I just personally find very interesting. So the first question of that is, so we have sort of a prevailing thought that economics and corporate interests, this is a prevailing thought that I don't know how this happened, but it doesn't make any sense. And that is that military is operating, the military industrial complex, or whatever you'd like to call it, big military, is operating more or less on their own, right? They have their own agenda. They're spreading democracy. They're getting rid of dictators in terrible place, right? So there's sort of been a narrative in that sense. But from the very beginning, if you look at military, government, and corporate interests, it's the triad, right? Military really exists to protect corporate interests around the globe, because if it didn't, I don't think the United States or any large empire, if you'd like to call it, any empire would really be able to hold on to the trade routes, be able to hold on to the dominance that they have in any economic setting. And so, can you speak to really the relationship between government, large corporate interests, and the military? Because I think it's been operating like this for maybe ever, but somehow that tie gets missed, especially here in the Western world, because nobody teaches that those three actually work together. It's somehow a conspiracy that the three work together, but it's the only thing that makes any sense. And the three have worked together in every other dominant hegemony that has existed before us.
Yeah, I guess this is the question of who runs the show, right? And
right.
In the 1950s, in the United States, a body of work came out led by a sociologist, political sociologist, C. Mills, worth a look, who actually lifted the lid on this network of elites. And at that time, it was a controversial book, of course, because it lifted the lid on it. The elite studies then kind of fell out of favor academically for quite a long time, as
I wonder why.
Well, and as other fads sort of took place. So the 60s and 70s had a very different sort of radical dimension in terms of the analysis. And of course, in the American Academy, there was also continually a very strong tradition of liberalism around guys like Rawls and others. So this idea of elite studies really didn't punch through. But in the last 10 years, again, there has been a revitalization of elite studies around some of the things that C. Wright Mills spoke about, which goes to the heart of your question. And it is abundantly clear that the networks of power that exist really join finance capital. I was going to call it defense capital, but I really should call it military capital, and the governing apparatuses together very, very tightly. And we know, for instance, that particularly in the United States context, military capital is actually in large part finance capital. The largest so-called defense contractors are listed companies where the incentives of their executives are aligned to exchange value by way of share price growth. So you can see that those industries are actually tied together at the hip. In terms of the role of armed forces and economic systems, I mean, there's obviously all of those traditional issues around protecting territories, right? But there has been also a reason why militia have existed to protect trade routes from piracy.
Mm-hmm.
And that has been a feature, of course, for centuries, because pirates have existed, and therefore trading countries usually develop a naval capacity to provide safe passage for their commercial interests. What's interesting, though, is to enable a nation to do that, to have the naval capabilities to provide safe passage, is quite a small requirement compared to, for example, the 800 bases that the United States has to resource every year across the globe. It doesn't need all those bases to protect trade routes. You know, it's overkill, so to speak. You know, pardon a very, very bad metaphor, and therefore that military footprint is there for more than just trade protection reasons.
Yeah.
In part, it's related to the circuits of how US dollar flows work. So US dollars flow through these systems partly by using US dollars to buy things that these allied countries' companies make, which I mentioned earlier. But it's also so these military bases is also a way by which US dollars cycles into these economies too. So US dollars goes through funding the bases, the wages of soldiers there.
Yeah.
They then get used to buy local currencies. The central banks then have a bunch of US dollars, and those US dollars need to get recycled back. And they get recycled back, of course, into the systems of fictitious capital, which is into American stocks, into American bonds. So, you know, these systems or these circuits are really there to facilitate the ways in which the US dollar has lubricated American hegemony over the years. Yes, a military has always been necessary for political communities that we now call nation states to defend their own space. And to some extent, when they are involved in the activity of commerce, they're there to protect those involved in commerce. But what we see today is far more than anything that's necessary for both of those objectives.
Very, very interesting.
All right. I have one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Here's my last question. And
Promise?
This is something, yes, from me. It's my last question. What is your prediction? And I know it's your prediction, but what is your prediction for how the world order is actually going to change over the next decade? Do you see China and US being equal economies? Do you see one rising above the other? How do you see BRICS growing? So what is your general prediction for the next decade for the world?
Look, I think that there's a range of possibilities. So rather than there necessarily being a single obvious likely outcome, I think that a number of possibilities could happen. There are some underlying drivers or trends. One of those is this multipolarization of the world's economic setup. Regions around the world are developing capability beyond what they had in the past. Some of that is made possible by the export of capital from China, for example. It's also made possible by the energy transitions that are taking place. Now, put aside exactly what the arguments are as to why the transitions are happening towards renewable energies, and just go to the economics of it. What we're starting to see is economic systems or energy systems that are rivaling the costs of our more mature energy systems, are actually delivering marginal energy costs at levels way below what current systems can deliver. And gross domestic product and energy consumption are very, very tightly correlated. In fact, it's probably fair to say that economic systems are actually energy transformation systems, where human beings harness the energy of the world, whether it's inert energy or other forms of energy, combine them and transform them into things that take a form that are useful and therefore valuable to us as humans. But energy doesn't go anywhere. It just changes, right? And some of it, of course, dissipates as waste back into the system. So these energy transformation systems become, I guess, activated when you have the ability to transform energy and the ability to do so in as least cost as possible. So these are very, very powerful trends happening. When that happens, we're going to see a more decentered world. So that's part of what I think is an inevitable process. Whether it's smooth or it's bumpy, that's the hard part, right? But it is become this decentered. That's the first thing. The second thing I think that is likely to play out is that the pressures building in the mature transatlantic political economies run the risk of bubbling over into some quite disruptive experiences in those communities themselves, with a potential to then flow over into other places. So that's the second issue. The third issue, and I'll go out on a limb here, and I'll just throw this out there because in a sense it's not a prediction, but it's more of a speculation. And it comes back to my part of the world, which is Asia, and what that might look like. So the United States and the Republic of Korea and Japan have been, of course, alliance partners for many, many decades. And it seems to me, or on the surface of things, the current activities taking place would suggest that those alliance relationships are actually strengthening. The problem is, or the other set of dynamics, so to speak, is that Japan and Korea have economically been reliant upon the ability to export to the United States and, of course, to China. But if the United States is seeking to reduce its trade deficits, it's going to have an adverse effect on the Japanese and Korean economies. The second thing that's interesting about these two parts of the world is that they lack energy and food security. Neither of them have the capability on their own territories of meeting their society's energy needs. Energy for people, food, and energy for machines. Now, not far from where these places are actually parts of the world with abundant energy resources and abundant food production capability. And I'm talking about Siberia. And the opening up of Far East Russia and the emerging transformations in the relationships between Russia and the DPRK, and the fact that the DPRK has actually abandoned the policy objective of reunification now, has the potential, as people come down, to invite, if you will, a rethink of the economic relationships in that part of the world. Japan and Korea need energy. They both need food. And on their doorsteps, or actually, if you will, in their backyards, they have access, in theory, to all the resources that they need if they could reconfigure their geopolitical relationships. So I'll throw that one out there, not as a prediction per se, but something to, in a sense, just be mindful of. But decentering of the world economy, continuing growth of national currency-based transactions, an expanded BRICS on the back of digitalized sovereignty in terms of a digital Westphalia. The risk for the United States is that it ironically becomes more isolated because as it seeks to isolate everyone else, what's actually happening is that it isolates itself. That would be unfortunate. So they're the sorts of things I'd be keeping an eye out for. Now, all of that creates a lot of pressure points because it creates a lot of change and impacts on existing distributions of wealth. And when that happens, of course, as I think you mentioned earlier, the prevailing elites will, or one of their responses is to clutch and grab for and to try and hold on to what they've got. And the risk that we run is that it could all turn very, very violent. And and I hope that that doesn't happen, and that the elites actually appreciate that they also have a responsibility to the world at large. You know, it's not much good having everything in the world around you is destroyed. So
Yeah.
They can have all the money that they want, but if there's nothing around them, then that money is not going to get you a good quality of life.
Yeah.
So hopefully the elites will come to their senses, and we can avoid the violence that I think is at the moment on our doorsteps.
Yeah, let's hope. Fingers crossed for
Yes,
that. So,
fingers crossed.
the last thing I would like to cover with you, Warwick, before we let you go, and then just for our community to know, I want them to know about the initiative you just launched. I happen to be part of that panel, very distinguished panelists. You recently launched what is called multipolar peace, and I couldn't ask for anything better than being part of it, because it's something now it is worth fighting for, it is worth contributing to. Absolutely. So if you will be kind and just share your thoughts and explain to our community here what this initiative is all about and what do you intend to achieve with it.
Look, multipolarpeace.com. It is, in a sense, what it hopefully the label says what's inside the box. It's a very simple, lightweight initiative, but one which I hope will pack some punch. The concerns that people have around the world that I've observed and that I experience is that in this period of significant change, that we run the risk that the transformation takes place violently and destructively. And we need to advocate for and create a space where we can think more constructively about what this change actually can look like. Now, this initiative aims to harness, in a very open way, a set of influential, vocal, thoughtful, and resourceful independent voices through independent media and such as you and your platforms, to educate people, inform people, help people think about what's at stake, and inspire them to imagine new possibilities, initiate actions in their own communities that support peaceful transformations, and ultimately create the impacts that we want. So there are, in a sense, 3 or 4 things that multipolar peace revolves around. The first one is that multipolarity is reality, and that it is the basis upon which we must work to create peace. Multipolar peace is about having a conversation about what that looks like. The second thing is that it recognizes that creating military blocs and alliances, particularly in peacetime, is counterproductive to the realization of peaceful objectives, and that, in fact, what we should be emphasizing is the role of neutrality in how countries relate to each other. Thirdly, and I guess this is what sparked this initiative, was the concerns that NATO, having left its calling card of death and destruction in Europe and elsewhere, now wants to expand globally. And multipolar peace also says that a global NATO is not a desirable outcome. And I guess the fourth thing is a very fundamental idea, and that is that prosperity and peace are codependent. They're actually symbiotic things. They're not choices. It's not one or the other. We don't have prosperity versus security. We don't have prosperity versus peace. We actually need to think about these as part and parcel of how we move forward as humanity. And we want to amplify the voices, and there are incredibly diverse voices, you know, with all sorts of political persuasions, if you think of it through traditional political lenses, but all share a common concern around these four pivotal pillars. So Multipolar Peace is a resource website to start with, where I've kicked it off, but really, you know, it just so happened that I got motivated in response to concerns about NATO to reach out to others who I think are doing an amazing job and put them all there so that people can see that they're not alone, that they have resources they can access. There's an incredible amount of educational content that is available now if we know where to go. That's the first thing. The second thing that I hope may happen is that as the community grows, people will share their experiences about how they're initiating the peaceful impacts that we all aspire to, and learn from each other's work in that regard and do it in our own backyards. How do we persuade others in our communities that there are better ways than a traditional kinetic first, military first response to challenges and differences of opinion? How to create institutions that enable differences to be respected, but commonalities to anchor our collaborations? That's the conversations that we need to have. Multipolar Peace is about creating an environment that can provoke those conversations, but most importantly, it's a way in which people like you and your audience can bring their voices to the table. You know, it's ultimately about, you know, the great masses of people who care and who can contribute to a better outcome as multipolarity unfolds. So what I should really be doing is thanking you for the work that you do.
Oh, you are most welcome. I mean, well, all of us, you know, start to become a cause. Sort of, you know, what's the point of, you know, you acquire education, you acquire experience and so forth. Then what? What are you doing for humanity? That becomes the cause for me personally. And I'm sure for you too, as well, Elizabeth, since we push in through all this for the sake of helping everybody to become aware. Just this initiative that Warwick launched, when I got the email from him, the text through X, it was like one of those normal reaction that's going to be short. Whatever way I can contribute. I hope it grows even bigger to the point where, you know, you're talking about people with deep pocket per se can assist in helping this cause. I do see it moving into that direction because this is exactly what we need from.
Well, and we're in. I mean, whatever support you need, we're in. You know, it's rough to. Go ahead.
Let me give you some examples. I was just going to give you some examples, and because I get asked this, you know, what's it for? And look, in many ways, of course, it's really for an emergent process to happen. But from my own perspective and experiences, not only is it to inform people, because without being informed, there's no way that you can, you know, even think about what you can do and how you should be involved. But I look at what's happening in the global economic sphere and the historical unevenness of economic development has been one of the most, well, it's unfair, number one, because it's seen some countries and some elites within those countries expropriate wealth from others. But it's also a source of greatest instabilities, because where you've got poverty, entrenched poverty, whilst others are doing very, very well at your expense, you've got the recipe for resentment and violence, and that's no good for anybody. So we've got to be able to bring humanity up across the world, and ways in which we can do that is by, you know, collectively becoming involved in the businesses that we work with and support in our communities. How do we mobilize our buying power, for example, to support a project initiative somewhere in the world that we can see transparently transform the quality of life somewhere. You know, it's those sorts of ways in which the world can actually become a smaller place, but in a way that's a little bit different from how the internet evolved over the last 20 odd years, and maybe in that process again become slightly flatter again. So they're the sorts of things that I think a growing community can harness. But it's all about the energy in the end, you know, whether it's energy to write things, the energy to make phone calls to Congress, representatives to senators, whether it's the energy to organize meetings, public meetings, rallies, you know, whatever it happens to be, it's actually about saying we are all stronger together. And, and we can actually, I think, build a way of thinking about multipolarity and a peace that's necessary to be part of that multipolarity by having global conversations.
You know, I think the only reason that any of this is really allowed to happen is because there is this sense, and this has been done on purpose, is that you are different from me. That someone somewhere else is so wildly different from you that they're a threat, right? And the only way that war to this extent can happen is if you dehumanize the person on the other side. The person on the other side has to be an absolute villain for that level of war to be acceptable to people. And if you watch it, it is what's in the collective news, propaganda, whatever you want to call it, is this sense of us versus them, is this sense of absolute scarcity. So if we don't protect what's ours, somebody on the other side of the world is going to come take it, and they're going to destroy your way of life. They hate you and they're terrible. Where the person on the other side of the world is a person. And fundamentally, humans all want the same thing. We want to be loved. We want to take care of our families. We want to do some good, leave the world better than we found it. And it's this artificial sense of us versus them that is allowing this to happen. And I do think you're right that as long as we actually come together and start to look at each other as we are global sisters and brothers, we are one, I think that that type of narrative will gain less and less of a foothold. Yeah. And I will say this is kind of a funny example, although it's not actually funny. But you know when the first Boeing whistleblower died? Yeah. So when the first, not funny, God rest his soul, but when the first Boeing whistleblower died of suicide, collectively, the world went, no, he didn't. And then the FBI went and looked into it. So there is absolutely the possibility, the reality of us together coming for causes that matter. And as long as you talk about it and make the choices for it, it actually makes a difference in the real world.
All right.
It's one of these things where you know, you're either afraid of difference or you actually see difference as part and parcel of the richness of what we have. And you know, for mine, if everybody was like me, I think that would be a very terrible thing, you know, for all sorts of reasons. But it's actually what makes being human, right? And it's that ability to interact with things different that bring perspectives and challenges, and that can bring excitement and growth. These things, but it always brings transformation, and with transformation comes growth. And look, it's taken me to this point in my life's journey to really, I think, begin to understand this. I kind of did a little bit earlier when I was younger. And when I was younger before then, I really didn't understand it at all. But I do think that as I traveled around the world, that sense of commonality is actually far more powerful than that fear of difference. But we've just got to bring it to the table.
Absolutely.
Indeed. Well, on that note, I, on behalf of the entire community, would like to say thank you very much, Warwick, for carving out time for us, for sharing your knowledge and insights. and for helping us to understand the ins and outs of really complex issues. To the viewers, I'll say you guys had a treat with Dr. Powell. I'm sure we will have him back here whenever his schedule permits. He's a busy person, and we are very, very grateful. So once again, thank you so much, Warwick, for really being here, and we look forward to having you again.
Absolute pleasure.